No one had the key. Yet inside the locked church pew lay a corpse. Miss Marple was already in the back row, watching. "Welcome to Marple's Spectre. I am your host, Mapleton. I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Hearing from you always brings a smile. Don't hold back. Let's begin." It began, as these things so often did in St. Mary Mead, with the illusion of tranquility. The villagers liked to say theirs was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, unless, of course, one counted the flower show squabbles, or the perpetual feud between Mrs. Price Ridley and Colonel Lumley over the church's choir arrangements. On the surface, it was a place of polished brass knockers, neatly clipped hedges and polite nods in the high street. Beneath it all, however, lay the usual web of small grievances and long memories, soil in which secrets grew as easily as roses. That Sunday morning, the sun filtered gently through the stained glass windows of St. Faith's Church, painting the pews in soft reds and blues. The vicar, Reverend Allerton, was midway through his sermon on forgiveness, an apt choice given the recent incident involving the Women's Guild funds, which had mysteriously vanished and just as mysteriously reappeared. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the fourth pew on the left, her gloved hands resting lightly on her handbag, was not paying close attention to the sermon. She had long ago learned that sermons were less illuminating than the congregation's faces. Her gaze wandered discreetly across the rows, Mr. Pritchard dozing beside his wife, young Lily Morton whispering something to her brother that made him stifle a giggle, Mrs. Bloxam staring rigidly ahead, as if daring anyone to notice her presence, beside a visibly uncomfortable Major Penrith. The village's newest arrival, Mr. Archibald Redfern, sat alone in the third pew on the right. An author of obscure theology texts, recently retired from Oxford, he had moved into the ivy-covered rectory cottage after its former tenant passed away. Miss Marple had heard from Mrs. Bantry that Mr. Redfern preferred books to people, and that he had refused 3 invitations to supper. Nevertheless, he came faithfully to church every Sunday, rain or shine, and listened attentively. Then came the moment that cracked the calm. The vicar's voice faltered. A subtle ripple passed through the congregation as heads turned toward the rear of the nave, where Mrs. Dinah Greeley, churchwarden, keeper of keys and inveterate collector of scandals, had entered hurriedly through the side vestry door. She looked unusually flushed, and was gesturing with urgency to the verger, Mr. Tompkins, who in turn left his post near the organ and disappeared down the northern aisle. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. It was only after the final hymn that Reverend Allerton addressed the congregation again, his tone strained with effortful composure. "My dear friends," he began, "I regret to inform you that there appears to have been a rather troubling incident discovered this morning in the church. For reasons that will soon become clear, I must ask everyone to remain seated for the time being." Murmurs broke out instantly. Miss Hartnell leaned across to Mrs. Price Ridley and whispered something sharp. A child began to cry, hushed quickly by its mother, and in the silence that followed, Mr. Tompkins reappeared, white-faced and breathless. "The locked pew, sir," he muttered. "Number 17, we've had to force it open." Miss Marple turned to the right-hand side of the church, where the pews reserved for old families and benefactors lay. Number 17 was the Compton family pew, long unused since old Mrs. Compton died 2 years ago, and her son, Lionel, had taken up permanent residence in South Africa. And then the verger said it plainly, his voice shaking. "There's a body inside. A man. Shot through the chest. And I swear the pew was still locked when I came in at 7 this morning." Gasps filled the church. Someone dropped a hymnal with a loud thud. Mrs. Bantry clutched at her husband's arm, and Reverend Allerton stumbled back a step, but Miss Marple didn't gasp. She simply looked down at her gloved hands again, her mind already reaching backwards through that morning's small details, and further still, through years of human frailty she had quietly catalogued, toward the question that already shimmered at the heart of it all. Why would someone go to the trouble of locking a man into a pew no one ever used, unless they meant for him to be found in a place of supposed sanctuary? A locked pew, a hidden corpse, and in a village where every person, however respectable, had at least one secret carefully tucked away. The service, it seemed, had only just begun. Outside St. Faith's, the Sunday sun shone with an almost indecent brightness for such a grim occasion. The church bell had not tolled, and the organist had abandoned her post, her sheet music fluttering to the floor. No one had yet been allowed to leave. Constable Drake, red-eared and breathless, had arrived. In a flurry of bicycle spokes and apologies, barely able to comprehend the gravity of what he was being told. The words "dead body" and "locked from the inside" had sent him stammering into his notebook, his pencil shaking like a leaf in a breeze. Inside, the pews had fallen silent again, save for the low, urgent whispers that grew like ivy in every direction. Miss Marple, still seated in her place, looked almost sleepy, though a very observant person might have noticed how her blue eyes missed nothing. "I always said that pew was cursed," Mrs. Price Ridley muttered behind her fan. "Ever since that ridiculous incident with the owl. Don't you remember, Jane?" Miss Marple gave a vague murmur, though she certainly did remember the owl, an unfortunate creature that had flown in through the open window during evensong and frightened the choir boys into shrieking retreat. But a body in a locked pew was rather more pressing than avian intrusions. Constable Drake, still fumbling with the brass buttons of his uniform, attempted to assert authority. "Right. No one's to leave until I've taken your statements," he called. "Please remain in your seats, Reverend." Reverend Allerton, pale and visibly perspiring, gave a nervous nod and tried to calm the flurry of voices that had begun again. "Please, everyone, do as the constable says. I'm sure this will all be sorted quite quickly." No, one believed that. Miss Marple's attention drifted to the young man now crouched in the aisle near pew 17. Constable Drake had lifted the latch himself and confirmed what Mr. Tompkins had already described. The door had been locked from the inside, or rather it appeared so. The latch had required forcing open, and inside sat the corpse of a man no one seemed to recognize. He was middle-aged, respectably dressed in a dark suit with faint pinstripes, and his head had slumped forward in a manner both theatrical and final. A single entry wound over the left breast suggested death had been immediate. "Never seen him before," murmured Mr. Tompkins to the Reverend, casting anxious glances about. "Don't look local, clean shoes, no mud on 'em, must have come by car." "A stranger," whispered Mrs. Bantry from her pew. "What would a stranger be doing in our church?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Miss Marple said softly. At that, Mrs. Bantry gave her an odd look. "You think he came here on purpose?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But more. Curious still, who locked him in and why?" By then, the more composed of the villagers had begun to piece themselves into tidy clumps. Mrs. Hartnell, stern and bristling, marched over to the vicar to demand answers. The little sisters whispered, behind gloved fingers, occasionally glancing toward the pew in question with horrified fascination. Major Penrith muttered darkly about young people and their drugs, and Mr. Pritchard, who had finally awoken, looked bewildered as his wife explained everything in half-panicked whispers. Miss Marple did not rise, nor join any of these clusters. Instead, she turned slightly, her eyes flicking to the north-facing window, the one beside the side chapel. It offered a narrow view of the outer churchyard and the tool shed beyond. At this hour, with the service due to have ended, the graveyard should have been deserted. It was not. A figure moved quickly among the gravestones, tall, lean, and moving with a nervous energy. He bent low as though retrieving something from the base of one stone, then disappeared around the rear of the church. Miss Marple didn't turn her head to follow him. Instead, she simply folded her hands again and whispered, "Curious." Moments later, Constable Drake returned, looking flushed. "Right," he called. "The inspector's on his way from Much Benham. Until then, I'll be needing names of anyone who did leave the service before it started." Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Bantry again. "Do you recall seeing young Michael Roper this morning?" Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Michael? The school teacher's boy? No, come to think of it, I didn't." "Nor I," Miss Marple murmured. "Odd. He usually attends with his aunt, doesn't he?" Mrs. Bantry pursed her lips. "And she was here. Alone," Miss Marple said gently. "Rather unusual." Indeed, Miss Lydia Roper had been seen entering the church alone, which was notable only because such things were not done lightly in St. Mary Mead. Appearances mattered. So when a young man suddenly vanishes on a Sunday morning, when every decent soul is either in church or seen not to be, one takes note. The atmosphere within St. Faith's grew heavier by the minute, thick with suppressed speculation. Inspector Craddock arrived shortly thereafter, grey-haired, sharp-eyed, and just familiar enough with Miss Marple to nod respectfully her way before moving on to the verger. A swift assessment followed. No one recognized the victim. There were no identification papers. The wallet was gone. No weapon found. But in the breast pocket of the man's coat, folded precisely and somewhat curiously, was a blank card, cream-colored, with a single word embossed at the center in gold. Atonement. The discovery caused a ripple of confusion and sudden religious unease. Reverend Allerton, upon hearing it, looked briefly stricken and had to be seated with a glass of water. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat in thoughtful silence. A sermon on forgiveness, she said softly, and a corpse carrying atonement in his coat pocket. It rather gives one pause. Mrs. Bantry gave a visible shiver. Do you think it's a message? Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then, if so, it was meant for someone who would understand it. Across the nave, Miss Lydia Roper had risen from her pew and walked stiffly toward the doors. When Constable Drake moved to stop her, she gestured to her throat, suggesting breathlessness, and waved a bottle of smelling salts in explanation. Her departure was permitted. Miss Marple observed it all with calm detachment. She was no longer watching the obvious. No, she was noting who hadn't spoken, who had said too much, and who looked just a touch too relieved when suspicion veered in another direction. Outside, the inspector ordered the church sealed. No one in, no one out. Inside, Miss Marple leaned back slightly and whispered to herself, "People do odd things when frightened, and odder still when they believe themselves forgiven." The puzzle had only just begun. Inspector Craddock stood by the vestry door, a folded handkerchief pressed to his forehead, a frown fixed between his brows. He had already interviewed the verger, Reverend Allerton, and two elderly witnesses who had offered more confusion than clarity. The body in pew 17 remained untouched for the time being, pending the arrival of the coroner, but the inspector's questions had already begun carving invisible furrows through the fabric of var. St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had stayed seated throughout, speaking to no one but observing everyone. She had long learned that one could accomplish more with silence than with interruption. Now, as Inspector Craddock approached her with cautious respect, she gave him a polite smile. "Miss Marple," he said in his usual tone, equal parts, admiration and wariness. "I'm certain you've already noticed more than I have." She demurred with a small laugh. "Oh, I wouldn't say that, Inspector, though I have noticed one or two things that struck me as curious." Craddock folded his arms. "Do share." "Well," she began, her tone mild, "I couldn't help but notice the young man who left the churchyard during the commotion. Rather tall brown-coat hurried gait. He went around the back toward the shed." Craddock straightened. "You saw that?" "I did," she replied simply. "And I believe it may have been Michael Roper. You remember Lydia's nephew?" "I thought he hadn't come to church today." "That's precisely it," Miss Marple said gently. "He hadn't come, and yet he seemed quite determined to leave." Craddock muttered something under his breath and waved over Constable Drake. "Find Michael Roper. Quietly. Ask around. Don't scare the boy." As the constable strode off, Craddock turned back. "He's always been a quiet one. Taught classics at the girls' school in Lower Fenton. Bit of a recluse. Sometimes," Miss Marple mused, "those who are quietest have the most to conceal, and his Aunt Lydia, you know, wasn't always so cold. She changed about a year ago. After he came to live with her. Curious timing." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You think the victim might have known him?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that the card with the word atonement wasn't a sermon note or an abstract gesture. It was personal, and someone in that church recognized it for exactly what it was." Before Craddock could reply, a voice rang out behind them. "I demand to know why we are being detained like criminals." Mrs. Price Ridley, in full tilt, was standing now beside Colonel Lumley, who looked more irritated at her volume than at the situation. "I'm afraid," Craddock said calmly, Until we determine who the deceased is and how he came to be locked in that pew, everyone remains a witness. Or possibly more. Mrs. Price Ridley turned pink. Are you insinuating I— Of course not, madam. But let us not forget. The door was locked. The man did not die by accident. Miss Marple tilted her head. And more to the point, he was meant to be found. The placement was theatrical, a church pew during the main Sunday service. Someone wanted the shock. Craddock nodded, which rules out a spur-of-the-moment killing. And perhaps, she added, even rules out a local mutt unless that local wanted to send a message. There was a pause. Then Craddock exhaled and leaned closer. There's something else. We found wax residue on the inside latch. Miss Marple's brow lifted. Candle wax. It seems someone dripped it into the latch mechanism, enough to hold it in place until the wax was solid. The door would appear locked, though it could have been closed from the outside. Once the wax cooled, no one could open it without force. Very clever, she said, very deliberate. Their murmur by the church entrance drew their attention. Constable Drake had returned, somewhat flustered, dragging behind him a lanky young man with tousled brown hair and a defensive posture. Michael Roper looked more tired than frightened, but his eyes darted as he entered. I didn't do anything, he said quickly before anyone could ask. I didn't kill anyone, I swear. I just didn't want to be involved. Craddock gestured him toward the vestry. Let's talk privately. Mr. Roper. Michael hesitated, then caught sight of Miss Marple. His shoulders stiffened. For a brief moment, something passed between them. Not recognition, but perhaps the fear of being recognized. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. The doors closed behind Michael and the inspector, leaving a vacuum in the nave. Silence. Returned, filled only by the faint ticking of the church clock. Miss Marple finally stood. She moved slowly toward the Compton pew, though it was still roped off. She did not cross the barrier. Instead, she examined the carpet near it, old wool, red once but now faded by time and boots. She crouched slightly, then plucked something from the floor with her gloved fingers. A tiny fragment of dark wax, nearly invisible against the shadowed edge of the pew. She didn't pocket it. She didn't need to. The mind, once sharpened by years of watching life unfold in all its quiet dramas, required little help in preserving details. A few feet away, Reverend Allerton was seated on a wooden chair, his head in his hands. You mustn't blame yourself, Miss Marple said, approaching him gently. The church is not to blame for what others bring into it. He looked up, startled. Do you think this murder was meant as a symbol? I think, she replied, that murder is rarely symbolic to the murderer. It is urgent, immediate, practical. The setting, however, that is often chosen very deliberately. His lips parted, but he seemed to falter. Is there something you're not telling us, Reverend? A beat passed. Then he shook his head. I knew him. The man in the pew. His name was Clive Trevelyan. I hadn't seen him in over 15 years. Miss Marple's voice was soft. You're sure? Yes. He was a student of mine, years ago, before I took my orders. Brilliant but troubled. He wrote to me 6 months ago, said he needed to make peace. Did he come here because of you? The vicar hesitated. Perhaps. He asked if he might visit. I said yes, but he never replied again. I thought he'd changed his mind. Miss Marple nodded slowly. He hadn't. He came. But someone didn't want him to speak. A door opened. Michael Roper stepped out of the vestry, pale but composed. Craddock followed, face unreadable. Miss Marple's eyes moved between them. She didn't speak, but the next move was already forming in her mind. A man from the past, a message of atonement, a locked pew, and a community too tidy for its own truths. She would find the crack. She always did. Michael Roper stood near the vestry door, hands clenched behind his back, his face drawn tight across the bones of anxiety. There was a nervous tremor in his jawline that hadn't been there an hour ago, but it was the look in his eyes that caught Miss Marple's attention, a subtle mix of dread and calculation, as though he were trying to weigh exactly how much. Truth was safe to release. Inspector Craddock had emerged behind him and said nothing for a moment. He merely looked at the gathered congregation, which had now thinned somewhat as the infirm and the insistent had been allowed home under police escort. The pews no longer felt sacred, now just uncomfortable wooden rows where secrets had been, aired and whispers shared behind gloves. The inspector cleared his throat. "Mr. Roper," he began, "has admitted to seeing the deceased this morning, but insists he was unaware of his identity until I showed him a photograph recovered from the victim's inner pocket. A small one, grainy, folded and worn. It showed a younger Michael standing beside a man who is unmistakably Clive Trevelyan." A gasp echoed faintly from the right-hand pews. Miss Lydia Roper, her face now ghost-pale beneath her netted hat, stood rigid as a statue. Her gloved hand tightened around the top of the pew before she slowly sat back down, as if her knees had lost their conviction. Miss Marple's gaze never left her. Craddock continued. "According to Michael, Trevelyan was an old family friend, a benefactor of sorts, but their connection became strained. Michael didn't meet anyone's eyes. He was my father," he said softly. "Illegitimate, never acknowledged publicly, but he supported me, discreetly, for a while." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Even Colonel Lumley refrained from one of his usual murmured judgments. Miss Marple turned slightly, her tone calm. "And you believe he came to reveal this?" "I think so," Michael answered. "We'd exchanged letters. He said he wanted to make amends, to explain things. He wanted to meet in the church privately before the service began." "Did you meet him?" asked Craddock. Michael nodded reluctantly. "Yes, just after 6 this morning. I came early, through the north gate. He was already waiting by the chapel door. We talked. I was angry. He offered me money again. But I told him that wasn't what I wanted. I told him to leave." "And did he?" Michael hesitated. "He said he needed to speak to Reverend Allerton as well. Said it was part of his redemption. I left. I didn't see him again." Miss Marple's voice, so gentle and unassuming, slipped into the silence. "And yet you were seen in the graveyard, not long after the body was discovered." "I'd come back," Michael said, not trying to lie now, but struggling. "When the church started filling up, I thought he might still be there. I wanted to make sure he was gone, that he hadn't done something reckless." "What would he have done that was reckless?" Craddock asked carefully. Michael looked at his aunt. "You'd have to ask her." Lydia Roper flinched, her jaw tightening. "There's nothing I can tell you," she said quickly. "Whatever. Michael is saying it's the past." "No," Miss Marple said. "The past is only ever dormant in a village, never dead, especially when it's tied to something as inconvenient as truth." Lydia's composure broke. "It was an affair. Brief. Foolish. Clive was a lecturer. I was barely out of school. It ended before it began. He sent money when I was born, but he never wanted to be a father. Not truly." Miss Marple's tone did not shift. "And yet now, after all these years, he returns to the very village where the child lives, where you live, and wishes to talk about atonement." Craddock crossed his arms. "He might have meant to make the relationship public." Lydia turned away. "He wouldn't have. Not after all this time. What would be the point?" "There is always a point when guilt builds up," Miss Marple replied softly. "Especially if the weight becomes unbearable. But the timing, that's the part. That troubles me." Craddock nodded. "Why now?" Miss Marple glanced toward the pulpit. Why indeed would a man long absent, long silenced, choose to arrive at St. Faith's today, on this Sunday, on the very morning the Reverend preaches about forgiveness? Craddock blinked. "You think it wasn't coincidence?" "I think," she said, "that someone invited him." Michael turned toward her sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," she answered, "that you weren't the only person he had written to. That perhaps this meeting was arranged not just by him, but by someone who feared what he might reveal." She let the silence hang for a moment longer. And who better to silence him than the one who once depended on his silence? Lydia Roper rose to her feet again. "That's enough, Miss Marple. You may be clever, everyone knows that, but this is no parlor game." "No, Miss Roper," Miss Marple replied gently. "It is not. It is a murder, a deliberate one. And The wax in the latch, the careful placement in the pew, the blank card with its single word. All these are not signs of panic. They are signs of calculation. The killer wanted us to understand something, to feel something. Perhaps guilt, or perhaps fear. Craddock stepped forward again. "Miss Roper, where were you between 6 and 8 this morning?" Her mouth opened, then closed. Her breath caught. "At home," she whispered. "Anyone confirm that?" A pause. "No," she admitted. Michael looked stunned. "You thought I'd done it. I thought you'd lose everything if he went public," she said quickly. "Your position at the school, your name, everything. So you came here. I only wanted to talk to him, to reason with him. But he was already dead when I arrived, I swear it." Craddock's voice was level. "Why didn't you come forward?" "Because I panicked," she whispered. "I knew how it would look. I didn't touch anything. I ran, and when I heard the doors were locked and the body found, I knew I'd be seen as guilty." Miss Marple studied her. "You may not have killed him, but someone did, and they were in this church this morning, watching, waiting." Craddock turned to the constable. "Send for a team to search the church grounds again, especially the tool shed," Miss Marple added, "and speak with the choir boys. Children notice things adults don't. One of them might have seen something when they arrived to practice. So the hymnals." Craddock gave her a look of grudging admiration. "You're always 3 steps ahead, aren't you?" Miss Marple smiled, modest and unreadable. "Oh no, Inspector. I merely try to keep pace with human nature. It rarely surprises me. But murder? That's often quite dull in its motive. It's the execution that tells the tale." And as the late morning sun tilted over the crooked headstones outside and shadows lengthened into the nave, Miss Marple folded her hands once again, her thoughts turning not to what was already known, but to what still resisted the light, because somewhere in St. Faith's, perhaps even still within these walls, walked a person who had orchestrated a quiet, contemplative killing. And Jane. Marple intended to meet them before they had time to do it again. The search of the church grounds commenced with a quiet urgency. Constable Drake, guided by Inspector Craddock's curt instructions and Miss Marple's gentle but precise suggestions, combed the perimeter of the graveyard, while a second constable, brought in from Much Benham, inspected the tool shed near the vestry. The interior of the small wooden structure was cramped and musty, filled with gardening implements, brass polish, wax candles, and bundles of old hymnals bound with string. Nothing immediately screamed foul play, but to Miss Marple's mind, the absence of something could speak just as loudly. She stood near the edge of the garden path, gloves still on, watching as a young choir boy with freckles and anxious eyes was coaxed toward her by Mrs. Bantry, who had assumed a sort of honorary, martial role in managing the more delicate witnesses. The boy, Nicholas Hobb, age 9, shuffled forward reluctantly. "Now, Nicholas," Miss Marple said kindly, crouching just enough to meet his gaze. "You were here early this morning, weren't you? For choir rehearsal?" He gave a nervous nod. "And did you see anyone unusual? Perhaps someone you didn't know, or someone you did know, acting strangely?" Nicholas squinted up at her. "I saw someone in the Compton pew. Before the rest came in, he was sitting all still like he was praying." "Are you quite sure?" she asked softly. He nodded again. "I thought it was Mr. Redfern at first. He sits there sometimes, but this man was hunched over." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you tell anyone?" "I wanted to, but Mrs. Greeley said I shouldn't be peeking about." Mrs. Bantry gave a huff. "Well, no one should be keeping children from telling the truth in a matter like this. Shame on her." Nicholas looked to Miss Marple again. "I did see something else. When I was near the shed, I had to go round back for the spare thurible. Jane, someone came out the back door of the church and went in there." "A man?" she asked. Nicholas frowned. "I think so. He had a long coat, brownish. He walked all funny, not limping but stiff, like he didn't want to turn his head." Miss Marple exchanged a brief glance with Inspector Craddock, who had quietly approached during the exchange. "Time frame?" Craddock asked the boy. "When did you see this?" "Just before the bells started ringing," Nicholas said. "I remember because the bells always start after I get to my seat, and I was still outside." Craddock straightened. "That puts it around 8:45, Miss Marple murmured. "Too close to the beginning of the service for the killer to have left unnoticed through the front, but through the back, possible." especially if they'd already prepared the latch with wax. They simply shut the door and let the illusion hold. The inspector glanced back toward the shed. And perhaps discarded something before vanishing. He turned to the constable. Go through every shelf, check the rafters, the bin outside too. As the search intensified, Miss Marple made her way back inside the church, now echoing with the uncomfortable quiet of dispersal. Most of the congregation had been allowed home, save for a handful still being spoken to. Mrs. Price Ridley, who refused to leave without a full summary. Colonel Lumley, who remained largely because no one had told him otherwise. And Mr. Archibald Redfern, the reclusive theologian, who sat stiffly on the end of a pew, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Miss Marple, never one to intrude without intent, approached slowly. "Mr. Redfern," she said in her mildest voice, "I do hope you're bearing up well." He looked up, blinking as if startled to be noticed. "Oh, yes, quite. Terrible. Business. Quite out of the ordinary." "Yes," she said, "and so unsettling to have it occur in one's own place of worship." He hesitated. I didn't know the man. That is to say, I saw him once or twice, at the corner shop, I believe, but we never spoke." Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, I shouldn't imagine you did. But I found myself wondering, when you noticed the Compton pew was occupied this morning, did it seem odd to you?" Redfern stiffened. I didn't notice it was occupied at all." "No?" she asked, tilting her head. "That's curious, because young Nicholas Hobb, who arrived not long before the bells, saw someone sitting in it already. Someone," he said, "who reminded him of you from a distance." He paled. "I only mention it," Miss Marple continued smoothly, "because pew 17 is directly ahead of where you usually sit, and it would be very hard not to notice a body slumped forward on the bench, especially with the morning light falling just so through the stained glass." Redfern's throat worked silently for a moment. "I suppose," he began, then faltered. "I suppose I may have seen a figure, but I didn't look closely. I don't like to stare." "Of course not," she said. "And yet, one does see things, even unconsciously, especially when the same people are seated in the same places week after week. When something is different, it tends to draw the eye, even for a man who prefers solitude." He looked at her then, truly looked, and there was a brief flicker of something behind his eyes. Not guilt, but fear, certainly. "I didn't kill him, Miss Marple," he whispered. "But I knew him, from years ago." "Ah," she said softly. "I thought that might be the case. I was his student once at a summer seminary. He was brilliant, but harsh, unforgiving. He dismissed me from the course, accused me of plagiarism, and was it true? Redfern didn't answer at first. Then it was a misunderstanding, but it ruined my academic path. I rebuilt. But he never acknowledged the damage." Miss Marple nodded. "And when you saw him here?" "I didn't speak to him. I avoided him. I was afraid he might remember me and dismiss me again." "Silly, I know." "Not silly," she said. "People carry old wounds more quietly than you'd expect." Craddock entered just then, walking with brisk purpose. His boots echoed slightly on the flagstones. "We've found something in the bin outside the tool shed," he said. "A brown overcoat, still damp from morning dew. Inside the pocket, candle wax and a half-used matchbook from the King's Arms." Miss Marple exhaled. "Well then, that puts us somewhere." Redfern, clearly disturbed, rose to his feet. "You don't think I—" "No, Mr. Redfern," Miss Marple said, watching him kindly. "But someone hoped we would." The inspector nodded. "A planted clue, perhaps, or a diversion. But if the coat doesn't belong to any of the regular churchgoers, we may finally be dealing with someone from outside St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple turned toward the stained glass again, watching the shifting colors spill over the floor. "Perhaps," she murmured, "but sometimes outsiders arrive only to stir up what locals hoped had stayed buried." Her eyes lingered on the sunlight, just catching the corner of pew 17. "No," she said at last, "I still believe the motive lies here, among us. The coat may be from elsewhere, but the grudge, the reason, was born right here in this parish." And with that she moved past them, one hand brushing lightly along the pews as though feeling for some vibration left by the day's cruel interruption. Miss Marple wasn't just looking for clues now. She was listening for who in all this hush had lied without even opening their mouth. Miss Marple moved with unhurried grace back into the nave, her fingertips trailing along the cool varnish of the pews. The heavy air, still saturated with unease, seemed to settle differently now, thicker in places, thinner in others, as though the church itself were holding its breath. She paused briefly at pew 17. Though cordoned off with a simple rope and an officer standing discreetly nearby, the space exuded a strange pull, as if the act of murder had stained more than just wood and woolen carpet. She bent slightly, not enough to draw attention, and studied the floor around the pew. The waxy flecks she had noted earlier were still there, tiny, overlooked, yet persistent. The sort of thing people missed when they focused on grander, more dramatic evidence. But murder, as she often reminded herself, was very rarely dramatic in nature. It was, more often than not, a careful calculation. Behind her, Inspector Craddock approached at a subdued pace. His footsteps were quieter now and his voice lower, both perhaps influenced by Miss Marple's measured stillness. "We've traced the matchbook to the King's Arms in Lower Fenton," he said. "They recall a man matching Trevelyan's. Description dining there alone last night. Left after 10. Miss Marple straightened, her voice thoughtful. "Lower Fenton is 3 miles by road, not so far for a man with a purpose. Or with an appointment," Craddock replied. "Yes," she murmured. "And we still haven't determined who arranged that meeting." Craddock sighed. "Michael and Lydia deny inviting him. Redfern says he saw him, but not until he was already seated in the pew. And Reverend Allerton insists he hadn't received any letter." Miss Marple turned toward the altar. "Letters are easily misplaced. Or intercepted." He raised a brow. "You suspect someone else opened it?" "I suspect," she replied, "that whoever killed Clive Trevelyan knew precisely where he would be and when. Which means they either orchestrated it or had prior knowledge of someone else's plan." Craddock frowned. "Which brings us back to motive. Lydia? To protect her nephew? Redfern? For revenge? Michael himself?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Too easy. All of them. Too visibly entangled. I often find, dear Inspector, that the ones who seem closest to the storm are rarely the eye of it." They were interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Dinah Greeley, her face pinched with poorly suppressed outrage, and her handbag clutched with near violence against her coat. "I must speak to someone," she announced, casting accusatory glances. "At both of them. This whole business has been handled atrociously. I am the churchwarden, and I should have been consulted." Craddock gave a long, suffering sigh. "If you have something relevant to share, Mrs. Greeley, please do." She gave a sniff, then leaned closer to Miss Marple, as if sensing a more sympathetic ear. "It's about the candles, the ones for the All Souls Memorial Shelf. I prepare them every Saturday afternoon, 12 ivory candles for 12 names. I place them in a box in the vestry, and they're untouched until I light them during evensong. But this morning, when I checked the box, one was missing." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "When did you last see the full set?" "Yesterday evening. I came by to drop off the floral arrangements. The candles were all accounted for then." "And this morning, you found only 11? "Yes. I assumed it was a mistake, but now—" She hesitated, her voice dropping. "You don't think someone took it to use as part of, well, that?" Craddock stepped in. "It's possible. Thank you, Mrs. Greeley." But Miss Marple was already thinking through the implications. Wax, timing, a candle known to be missing before the church filled. It aligned too perfectly. She turned slightly, her mind recalling the layout of the vestry and the cupboards behind the memorial shelf. The candles were stored within reach, easy to slip one out unnoticed, especially by someone familiar with the routine. Someone who would not seem suspicious moving freely about the church. "Inspector," she said gently, "I think it's time we spoke with Mr. Tompkins again." The verger had been milling about near the south door, red-faced and restless, and came reluctantly when summoned. He was a barrel-chested man with thinning hair and a habit of wiping his hands on his cassock, even when they were already clean. "Mr. Tompkins?" Miss Marple began. "Do you recall who arrived first this morning?" He scratched his head. "I always get here before 6, Mum. I unlock the main doors, make sure the heaters are on if needed, check the flowers. I was in the vestry a good while." "Did you see anyone else?" "Reverend Allerton came in just before 7, same as always. Mrs. Greeley came in just after. Didn't notice anyone else until the choir started trickling in." Miss Marple nodded. "And you're certain the main doors were locked when you arrived?" "Oh yes, had to unlock them myself." She paused. "And the side chapel door? The one that opens toward the shed?" Tompkins hesitated. "That one's been a bit stiff. I usually don't check it unless there's a reason. Come to think of it, I didn't check it today, couldn't say whether it was locked or not." Craddock's voice hardened. "So someone could have come in that way?" "Suppose so," Tompkins admitted uneasily. Miss Marple thanked him and stepped back, her mind fitting pieces into place like shards of stained glass in a fractured window. Someone had known about the service, someone who could enter unseen, light a candle, drip wax into a latch and slip away through a door no one checked. But most importantly, someone who understood symbolism. She looked again at the pew. The placement, the word atonement, the candle. It was no longer a murder committed in panic or out of simple fear. It was theatrical, yes, but not showy. It was intimate, almost liturgical. Redemption offered and refused. She turned toward Reverend Allerton, still seated alone, his face worn by worry. She approached him quietly. "Forgive me," she said, "but I must ask, are you certain you received no letter from Mr. Trevelyan?" He hesitated, then exhaled. "There was a note. It arrived 3 days ago, no signature, but it mentioned a confession. Said the writer would come during Sunday service and sit in the Compton pew. I thought it was someone from the parish, someone wrestling with guilt." "You didn't keep it?" He looked ashamed. "I burned it. I thought it was someone playing games." Miss Marple's voice was very soft now. "And when you saw the man in the pew this morning, you didn't recognize him?" "I recognized his expression," he said, "but not his face. It was the look of a man about to speak a truth that had cost him everything." Miss Marple nodded. "And someone knew he would sit there. Someone else knew he wouldn't leave." "Alive." She moved away without another word, her mind finally closing around something that had eluded her. Until now. Not the killer. Not yet. But the shape of the motive, traced faintly in the wax of a melted candle and the curved spine of a man who had come at last to be absolved, and was silenced before he could say the words. The truth, Miss Marple knew, would lie not in who hated him most, but in who feared his forgiveness. The evening cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead as the day's events settled into a fragile quiet. The church had been closed to the public, sealed off while the coroner and forensic experts examined the body of Clive Trevelyan. Outside, the village resumed its usual rhythms, but beneath the familiar surface, unease simmered like embers awaiting a spark. Miss Marple sat in her sitting room at her modest cottage, the soft lamplight illuminating a faint crease of concern across her brow. On the small table before her lay a neat pile of notes: the verger's routine, the missing candle, the wax in the latch, the evasions and half-truths of those closest to the victim. The threads were tangled, but she could feel the pattern beginning to emerge. A sharp knock at the door startled her. She rose and opened it to find Inspector Craddock, his expression both tired and resolute. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "may I come in?" "Of course, Inspector." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I have news," he began, taking a seat opposite her. "The coroner's report has come through. Cause of death is a single gunshot wound to the chest, as we suspected. But there's more. Traces of a rare poison were found on the bullet." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. "A poison on a bullet? That's quite unusual." "Indeed." "The poison is derived from a plant native to South America, deadly but slow-acting if ingested. It suggests a premeditated effort to ensure death, regardless of the shot itself. So the killer took no chances." "Precisely. And we've also learned that Mr. Trevelyan's pockets contained no identification, but a small folded note addressed to one Eleanor." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Eleanor? That name has not come up before." Craddock nodded. No one in St. Mary Mead seems to know an Eleanor. We're looking into visitors or acquaintances outside the village. She pondered silently. The choice of the Compton pew, the letter with atonement, the careful poisoning. There is a narrative here, Inspector, but it is incomplete. Do you think Eleanor might be the key? Perhaps, or a red herring designed to lead us away. Craddock frowned. There's been another development. Lydia Roper was found in tears this afternoon by Mrs. Bantry, confessing that she had received a letter from Clive only days before his arrival, one that suggested a secret meeting, not with Michael but with her. Miss Marple smiled faintly. So the invitation was wider than anyone admitted. Exactly. Lydia also admitted she wrote to Clive to arrange a meeting, hoping to resolve old debts. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, and yet she claims she did not expect him to show up today. Craddock nodded, which is why she left early claiming illness, but she did not tell anyone. Secrecy breeds suspicion. Furthermore, he said, we have confirmed that the brown overcoat found by the shed does not belong to any known parishioner or visitor. We're now searching the county for anyone matching the description. Miss Marple folded her hands. This man, Clive Trevelyan, seems to have been a catalyst, unraveling threads no one wished disturbed. Indeed, Craddock said. And with the poisoned bullet, the locked pew, the missing candle, it all feels like a staged confession, or a performance intended to shame. The clock chimed softly, marking the passage of the hour. Miss Marple's mind drifted back to the church, to the silent pew, to the words unspoken. There's still one thing troubling me, she said slowly. The wax in the latch, a delicate touch of symbolism, but also a method to delay discovery. Do you recall who last handled the candles? Craddock considered. Mrs. Greeley, the churchwarden. And did she mention if anyone else had access to the vestry? Mr. Tompkins, the verger, has keys, as does Reverend Allerton. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. It would be worth questioning them again, especially if one of them had a motive for silencing Mr. Trevelyan before he spoke. Craddock smiled. Faintly. You always cut straight to the heart of the matter. She smiled back. It helps that I've known the village for decades. I know the weight of its secrets. Shall I arrange for a meeting tomorrow morning? He asked. Please. As the inspector prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused. One more thing, Inspector. Have you considered that the second crime, the missing candle, the planted coat, the locked pew, was not merely about murder, but about sending a message? Craddock nodded gravely. I fear you're right. The following morning dawned grey and still. Miss Marple found herself drawn once more to St. Faith's, where the church doors were reopened to a wary congregation. Inside, the air was thick with whispered speculation and hidden glances. She was joined there by Inspector Craddock, Mr. Tompkins, and Reverend Allerton. The group's meeting was tense, the undercurrents of accusation barely concealed beneath polite conversation. Miss Marple observed them keenly, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the quickening of breaths, the avoidance of eye contact. Mr. Tompkins was the first to break. I've been thinking about the candle. If it was taken deliberately and for what purpose? Reverend Allerton answered quietly, a symbol of remembrance, yes, but also of light. To snuff it out is to deny that. Then the candle was meant to silence Mr. Trevelyan's voice, Miss Marple said softly. And the wax in the latch, Craddock added, to delay opening, to delay the truth. The verger's eyes flickered, and Miss Marple caught a momentary hesitation. Mr. Tompkins, she said, you have been here longer than anyone else this morning. Have you noticed anything out of place? Anyone who might have had a reason to prevent Mr. Trevelyan's confession? Tompkins swallowed hard. I suppose I have, but I did not wish to speak. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. We all have reasons to stay silent sometimes, but the truth demands courage. He looked at her, then at the others, and finally spoke. There was a visitor, not from here, someone who came to see the Reverend late on Saturday evening. They spoke in hushed tones. Reverend Allerton paled. I should have mentioned it. It was Mr. Trevelyan himself. And did you tell anyone else? No. Miss Marple nodded. The pieces fall into place. The visitor from outside, the secret meetings, the deliberate delay in discovery. All converged in a web spun long ago, now torn apart by the unyielding need for justice. Miss Marple stood, her expression serene but resolute. "Tomorrow, Inspector, I believe it will be time for a careful confrontation. The person who orchestrated this tragedy will reveal themselves, not through force but through the subtle cracks that only fear and guilt can create." Inspector Craddock nodded. "As always, Miss Marple, your insight lights the way, and—" As the morning light filtered through the stained glass, the village of St. Mary Mead held its breath, awaiting the moment when the truth, long hidden in shadow, would step into the light. The following afternoon brought a peculiar stillness to St. Faith's. The usual chatter of the village seemed muted, as if the air itself was charged with anticipation. Miss Marple arrived just as the church's heavy oak doors were unlocked to admit Inspector Craddock and the handful of villagers whose involvement demanded careful scrutiny. Inside, the familiar sense of wax and old wood mingled with the faint trace of tobacco smoke, a reminder that somewhere in these walls secrets had been discussed, confessions rehearsed, and truths evaded. Miss Marple stood near the altar, serene yet alert. Her eyes caught the subtle ways people shifted their weight, avoided glances, or spoke too quickly. The psychology of guilt, she mused, was never far from the surface. It showed itself in the smallest hesitation, the briefest flinch. Craddock gathered the group, Lydia Roper, Reverend Allerton, Mr. Tompkins, Mrs. Greeley, and Archibald Redfern, into a tight semicircle. He cleared his throat, his expression grave. "We're here to bring clarity to a tragic matter," he began. "I ask each of you to listen carefully and to speak honestly. The sooner the truth is laid bare, the sooner this community can heal." Miss Marple caught Lydia's eyes briefly. They were hard, guarded, yet flickered with vulnerability beneath the surface. She saw Reverend Allerton nod subtly, his fingers tightening around a folded piece of paper. Mr. Tompkins avoided eye contact, and Mrs. Greeley's lips pressed into a thin line. Craddock continued, "The evidence suggests the murderer had intimate knowledge of the church and its routines. The missing candle, the wax in the latch, the deliberate placement of the body in the Compton pew, these are not random acts, they carry meaning." Miss Marple stepped forward gently. "If I may." The room quieted further, if that were possible. "Symbols often speak louder than words," she said softly. "In a village like ours, where the past lives quietly beneath the surface, the murderer is counting on fear and silence. But guilt has a way of unraveling even the most carefully woven lies." She turned her gaze to Mr. Tompkins. "You have served St. Faith's faithfully for many years, yet this morning the vestry door was left unchecked. Why?" The verger's jaw twitched. I was distracted. I had some personal matters weighing on me." "Which?" asked Miss Marple, her tone inviting but firm. Tompkins swallowed. "My nephew, he's been in trouble with the law. I was worried about him." Reverend Allerton interjected, "If I may add, Tompkins has been under stress. It's not surprising he missed locking a door." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, but her eyes never left Tompkins. And yet the door was the only way for the killer to enter unseen. The wax that sealed the latch came from a candle meant for the All Souls Memorial. "Mrs. Greeley, you prepare those candles. Did you notice if any were missing recently?" Mrs. Greeley adjusted her glasses, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes, one was missing. I mentioned it yesterday." "Did you inform anyone?" "No, I thought it might have been misplaced." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Or taken deliberately." Archibald Redfern shifted in his seat. "All this talk of candles and doors feels like misdirection." Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward him. "Mr. Redfern, you once told me you had a difficult history with Mr. Trevelyan." Redfern exhaled slowly. "Yes, I was dismissed from Oxford after an accusation he made against me. It ruined my career, but I never wished him harm." "Yet you are here, and he is not," she replied. There was a tense silence. Craddock spoke next. "Mr. Redfern, where were you during the early hours of this morning?" Redfern's eyes flickered. "I was in my cottage, working late on my manuscripts." Mrs. Greeley frowned. "I saw your light on at one point, but then it went out suddenly." "Because I had finished for the night," he said stiffly. Miss Marple studied him carefully. You mentioned a difficult history. Do you hold any grudges still? Redfern looked away. Regret, perhaps, but not hatred. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a small smile. Sometimes regret is the heaviest burden of all. Craddock turned to Lydia Roper. You wrote to Mr. Trevelyan to arrange a meeting, but you left early this morning. Why? Lydia's voice was barely above a whisper. I was ill. I didn't want to face him. Or did you fear what he might say? She met Miss Marple's eyes. He threatened to expose the truth about Michael's parentage. I was afraid. Fear is a powerful motivator, said Miss Marple, but so is the desire to protect. Michael's absence was conspicuous, and the room felt thinner without him. Craddock cleared his throat. We have also learned from Nicholas Hobb, the choir boy, that he saw someone enter through the back door near the shed just before the service began. Someone wearing a brown coat. Redfern's face tightened. That doesn't sound like me. Miss Marple caught a glimmer in Tompkins' eyes, a flash of panic quickly concealed. Mr. Tompkins, she said softly, were you the one seen entering through the back door that morning? Tompkins stood abruptly, his face flushed. I went to check on the candles. I didn't realize it would cause such suspicion. Why didn't you mention it earlier? Miss Marple asked gently. I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid. It would make me look guilty. And what of your nephew? Was he involved? Tompkins shook his head. No, I swear it. Miss Marple's eyes settled on the verger with a steady calm. Mr. Tompkins, the truth is rarely harmed by being spoken aloud. It is only the lies that cause damage. The room held its breath. Inspector, Miss Marple said finally, I believe the killer is someone who feared forgiveness more than punishment. Craddock nodded slowly. And that fear led to murder. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Exactly. Now all that remains is for the person to reveal themselves. As the villagers exchanged uneasy glances, Miss Marple's gaze was steady, unblinking. She could see the fissures beneath the polished veneer, the hidden resentments, the unspoken betrayals. The locked pew had been a puzzle, but she had found its key. A desperate attempt to silence truth in a place meant for confession and redemption. And soon, very soon, the final act would unfold. The drawing room of Miss Marple's cottage had been arranged with quiet intention. A fire flickered low in the grate, casting soft shadows across the walls lined with well-worn volumes and trinkets gathered from a lifetime of observation. A small group had gathered there that evening. Inspector Craddock, Lydia Roper, Reverend Allerton, Mr. Tompkins, Archibald Redfern, and Mrs. Bantry, who insisted on being present as a pillar of decorum and quiet moral support. Miss Marple herself sat serenely in her favorite armchair, hands folded in her lap, her blue eyes sharp and steady beneath her silver hair. The air was heavy with anticipation, each participant acutely aware that the evening would hold revelations that could alter lives forever. She began softly. We have shared much over the past days. Secrets, half-truths, and shadows of the past have come to light. But it is time to put the pieces together and uncover the truth behind the tragic death of Mr. Clive Trevelyan. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Mr. Trevelyan's arrival in St. Mary Mead was not accidental, nor was his death spontaneous. He came seeking atonement, a word he made clear by the card placed carefully in his coat pocket. Her gaze swept across the room, resting briefly on each face. The location of his body, the Compton pew, was chosen deliberately, place once belonging to a family of old standing, now empty, much like the past he hoped to reconcile. She nodded toward Reverend Allerton. You, Reverend, knew Mr. Trevelyan from years ago, a student seeking guidance, wrestling with demons, of his own making. He inclined his head, silent. But it was not only you who held knowledge of this past. Turning now to Lydia Roper, Miss Marple's voice grew softer, yet carried unmistakable resolve. Mrs. Roper, you arranged a secret meeting with Mr. Trevelyan, hoping to resolve matters quietly. Lydia's lips trembled. Yes. I feared what he might say about Michael. I wanted to protect my family. Understandable, Miss Marple said, yet it was the fear of truth, not the truth itself, that led to tragedy. She shifted her gaze to Mr. Tompkins. Mr. Tompkins, you have served this parish faithfully for many years, yet on the morning of the murder you failed to secure the vestry door, allowing the killer to enter unnoticed. His eyes flickered with unease. I was distracted, worried about my nephew. I did not mean to leave a door open. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Distraction can be a convenient veil for intent. Tompkins looked down. I did what I could. Yet you were seen moving about the church early that morning near the tool shed. You had access, opportunity, and motive. He gasped softly. Miss Marple turned finally to Archibald Redfern. Mr. Redfern, your history with Mr. Trevelyan was fraught, dismissed, humiliated, with a career destroyed by his accusation. Redfern's hands clenched. I bore no ill will, only regret. Regret that can twist into resentment, I fear. The room tensed. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the assembled company. Now the moment has come to unravel the final thread. She paused, folding and unfolding her hands. The poison on the bullet was no accident, it was a guarantee. The wax in the latch was a lock on the truth itself, bought with delay. She fixed her eyes on Tompkins. Mr. Tompkins, you sought to protect your nephew from scandal, did you not? His voice faltered. Yes, but I would never kill. Yet you had access to the vestry, knowledge of the candle missing from the All Souls Memorial, and the ability to stage this act with great care. He looked up, desperation in his eyes. I found Mr. Trevelyan in the vestry late on Saturday night, threatening to reveal truths that would ruin my family. Miss Marple nodded. You feared his confession would bring disgrace, so you planned to silence him. Tompkins sank back, voice shaking. I did what I thought I had to. Miss Marple's voice softened. Murder is never a solution. It only deepens the wounds it tries to hide. She turned to the others. Let this be a lesson to us all. Fear of truth breeds darkness, but truth itself is the path to light. Inspector Craddock moved forward, placing handcuffs on Tompkins with a heavy sigh. As the men left to escort the verger away, Miss Marple remained seated, gazing thoughtfully into the fire. Mrs. Bantry approached gently. Thank you, Miss Marple. You've brought peace to a troubled village. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Peace is hard won, dear Mrs. Bantry, but it is worth every struggle. Outside, the night settled over St. Mary Mead, and though the shadows remained, the village breathed a little easier, knowing that justice, however slow, had been served. The days that followed felt unusually quiet in St. Mary Mead. The usual hum of village life, the clatter of teacups at the Crown, the soft murmur of voices at the post office, the rattle of the milk float seemed to pause beneath a veil of collective contemplation. Miss Marple, for her part, resumed her gentle rhythms, visits to the gardens, brief calls with old friends, and moments of solitude by her window overlooking the village green. Yet beneath her composed exterior, her mind was a whirlpool of reflections on the tangled threads of recent events. The truth had been laid bare, but as ever, the human heart left traces far more intricate than a mere solution to a murder. One cool afternoon, as the sun slipped behind a bank of grey clouds, Lydia Roper appeared at Miss Marple's door. She was pale but steadier than when last seen in the church. The burden of her past sins and fears seemed lighter, though not gone. Miss Marple, she began hesitantly, I came to thank you for your kindness and for helping us find some peace. Miss Marple smiled softly, inviting her in. You have all been through much, she said, and yet the path ahead is one of healing. Lydia nodded. Michael has been staying with friends since all this. I think he needs time to understand. Miss Marple settled into her chair. Time is a patient friend, Lydia, and understanding is the light that can dispel even the darkest shadows. They spoke quietly for some time, of forgiveness and the fragility of trust, of the need to face past mistakes to build a better future. Later that evening, Inspector Craddock dropped by unannounced, a rarity that pleased Miss Marple. I thought, you might like to hear, he said, settling into the armchair opposite her, that the case has attracted some attention. The county paper ran a piece, and while they respected the sensitivity, it stirred quite the discussion. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Curiosity is the lifeblood of villages, Inspector. Yes, and so is gossip, he replied with a grin. But more importantly, I wanted to thank you for your insight. Without your help, the investigation would have stalled. She inclined her head. I'm glad to have been of service. St. Mary Mead is a dear place. He hesitated. There is one matter, though. Some villagers remain uneasy about the silence. Before the truth emerged, about the secrets we all carry. There is talk of mistrust. Miss Marple sighed. Mistrust is the price we pay for secrets kept too long. But truth, when shared gently, can mend what lies broken. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the evening sounds drifting in from the village. Do you think the village will ever truly forget? Craddock asked softly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, dear Inspector, in places like St. Mary Mead, nothing is ever truly forgotten. But that is what makes the stories richer, and the community stronger. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The puzzle had been solved, justice served, and once again the delicate balance of human nature had been illuminated. Yet she knew that beneath the peaceful surface, the human heart would continue to hold its mysteries, waiting for another patient observer to listen, understand, and when necessary, uncover the truth. And so, as the village settled into the soft embrace of night, Miss Marple sipped her tea, content that for now at least, the light had returned to St. Mary Mead. The weeks that followed the verger's arrest unfolded with a muted calm, yet beneath that placid surface, the village of St. Mary Mead was slowly awakening to new realities. The murder of Clive Trevelyan had shaken more than just the church pews. It had stirred old resentments, unspoken regrets, and whispered questions that would linger like a faint undertow. Miss Marple continued her daily routines with the quiet grace for which she was known, her eyes ever watchful, her mind turning over the subtle ripples left in the wake of tragedy. She spent time with Lydia Roper, whose fragile composure was gradually bolstered by the support of friends and the tentative hope of reconciliation. Michael, too, had returned, though he remained cautious and guarded, haunted by the knowledge of his father's final, fatal journey to the village. One bright morning, as the sun filtered softly through the lace curtains of her sitting room, Miss Marple was visited by Reverend Allerton. His face bore the weight of the ordeal, but also the tentative relief of a man eager to begin anew. Miss Marple, he said quietly, I wanted to thank you for your kindness, your wisdom, and for helping the parish find its way through such dark times. She smiled gently. The church and its people are the heart of St. Mary Mead, Reverend. It is only natural to want to protect it. He hesitated, then asked, Have you noticed in all this how quickly wounds begin to heal once the truth is known, yet the scars remain? Yes, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, and sometimes those scars teach us to be more careful with each other. Their conversation drifted to the forthcoming memorial service for Clive Trevelyan, a solemn event, intended to bring closure and peace. Plans were made to include the missing candle from the All Souls Memorial, a symbol of remembrance and forgiveness. Later, as the day waned, Inspector Craddock stopped by to report on the lingering investigations. New information had come to light. Letters found among Mr. Trevelyan's effects hinted at a network of relationships extending beyond the village, suggesting that his story was far more complex than first thought. Miss Marple listened intently, then remarked, It seems, Inspector, that every life is a tapestry, woven with threads both visible and hidden. What appears simple is often anything but. Craddock nodded. And sometimes the most tangled threads are the ones closest to home. The two shared a quiet smile, a mutual respect forged through trials and triumphs. As twilight deepened, Miss Marple found herself walking through the village square. The familiar shops and cottages stood bathed in soft lamplight, the night air fragrant with blossoming honeysuckle and the distant murmur of evening prayers. She paused briefly near the churchyard, where the graves gleamed faintly beneath the moon. Among them was the Compton family plot, quiet and solemn. Rest now, she whispered softly. May the light of forgiveness shine ever onward. Turning away, she felt the enduring truth that had guided her through so many mysteries, that beneath the surface of every quiet village lay the depths of human nature, endlessly complex and endlessly fascinating. And with that thought, Miss Marple walked home, ready to face whatever new mysteries awaited with the same gentle curiosity and unwavering resolve. The chill of early morning had not yet lifted when Miss Marple stepped out onto her porch, the faintest hint of mist curling over the village lanes. The events of recent weeks had left an indelible mark on St. Mary Mead, but the daily rhythms continued, subtle and steady as ever. Even tragedy, she reflected, had a way of folding into the fabric of village life, becoming part of its story, rather than an interruption. As she made her way toward the church, the bells began to toll softly, calling the faithful to prayer. The village had gathered for the memorial service of Clive Trevelyan, and a sense of solemnity hung gently in the air. Faces were drawn but composed, the murmurs of grief mingled with whispers of forgiveness. Inside St. Faith's, the atmosphere was heavy yet hopeful. The pews filled with familiar figures, some still marked by the strain of recent days, others quietly curious about what healing might bring. Miss Marple took her usual seat near the back, her eyes briefly meeting those of Reverend Allerton, who stood at the pulpit with a steady calm. The service began with a hymn, voices rising together, a communal offering of solace. When the time came for remembrance, the missing candle from the All Souls Memorial was placed carefully beside the altar, its flame flickering with gentle warmth. Miss Marple's gaze rested on it for a moment, a silent prayer passing between the flame and her heart. Reverend Allerton's sermon spoke softly of grace, redemption, and the fragile beauty of second chances. He recounted the story of a man seeking atonement, a man who had returned to face his past and, in doing so, had left a legacy that challenged the village to confront its own truths. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the web of relationships that had come undone, the secrets kept, the courage found in confession, and the tragic consequences of silence. The village had been changed, yet not broken. As the service ended, villagers exchanged quiet words, some embracing, others lost in thought. Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light over the churchyard. The shadows of grief began to recede, replaced by the gentle promise of healing. Miss Marple lingered briefly among the gravestones, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the Compton family plot. The names there spoke of generations past, their stories intertwined with those still living. She whispered softly, "May we all find peace in the truths we carry, and courage to face the days ahead." Turning, she walked back through the village, the sounds of daily life stirring once more. The baker's cart rattled down the street, children's laughter echoed faintly, and the scent of freshly turned earth mingled with blooming roses. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself, knowing that while mysteries would always arise in the heart of St. Mary Mead, so too would kindness, resilience, and the enduring strength of community, and with that she stepped into the warmth of her home, ready to embrace whatever new stories awaited her watchful eyes and gentle heart. The soft glow of the evening sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead as the village settled into a rare, profound stillness. The day's memorial service had drawn to a close, leaving behind a mixture of sorrow, relief, and tentative hope. Yet inside Miss Marple's cozy sitting room, the final pieces of the puzzle were quietly assembling, waiting for their moment to fall into place. Miss Marple sat near the window, gazing out at the familiar village green, bathed in golden light. The village looked peaceful now, but she knew well that beneath such calm often lay turbulent waters. She had watched as fear, secrecy, and old wounds had been pulled to the surface in the wake of Clive Trevelyan's murder. And though justice had been served, the story was not yet fully told. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Inspector Craddock, looking wearier than usual, but resolute. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "I believe we are ready for the final step." She smiled gently. "Then let us not delay." Gathered once again in the drawing room were Lydia Roper, Reverend Allerton, Archibald Redfern, Mrs. Bantry, and, reluctantly, Mr. Tompkins. The verger sat apart, the weight of guilt heavy upon him, though his eyes flickered with apprehension. Miss Marple began, her voice calm but unwavering. We have uncovered the facts, traced the paths, and heard the fears that grip this village. Yet the heart of this mystery beats strongest in one question. Who feared the truth enough to silence it with murder? Her. Eyes met each person in turn, settling finally on Mr. Tompkins. You, Mr. Tompkins, carried the burden of protecting your family's reputation. You knew that Mr. Trevelyan's revelations could shatter that carefully built life. Tompkins swallowed hard. Yes, I was desperate. I never wanted to kill him. I only wanted to stop him. Miss Marple nodded. But desperation is a dangerous guide. She turned to Lydia. And you, Mrs. Roper, though afraid, acted with a mother's love, trying to shield your son. Lydia's lips trembled. I was frightened, but I never harmed him. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Archibald Redfern. You bore old wounds and regrets, yet held no desire for vengeance. Redfern nodded. It was sorrow, not hatred, that marked my heart. Finally, Miss Marple looked to Reverend Allerton. And you, Reverend, provided counsel and grace, a beacon in dark times. He bowed his head modestly. Miss Marple took a breath. The murder was a tragic attempt to keep shadows from the light, but light has a way of seeping through the smallest cracks. She stood slowly, her presence commanding yet gentle. The Locked Pew was both prison and stage, a place chosen to send a message. The candle's missing flame symbolized silenced truth. The poison ensured finality. Her eyes locked once more on Tompkins. Your actions have altered many lives, yet it is never too late for confession and for seeking forgiveness, not only from others but from oneself. Tompkins nodded, tears welling. I will face what comes. I pray that this village can heal. Miss Marple smiled, her voice softening. St. Mary Mead is a village of resilience. It has endured, as will you. As the evening shadows deepened, outside the window, a sense of closure settled over the room. Not complete peace, for wounds take time to mend, but the first fragile steps toward healing. Inspector Craddock stepped forward to escort Mr. Tompkins away, and as the door closed behind them, Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze resting on the flickering candle that had been returned to the All Souls Memorial. Truth, she whispered to the quiet room, is the light by which we find our way. And in the gentle hush of the night, St. Mary Mead breathed again, its story woven anew with threads of sorrow, courage, and enduring hope.